I'm Dr. Eric Castleberry, Professor of Media Production and Communication at Mid-America Christian University. And joining me in this Mass Communication Perspectives season of the pod is recent graduate from the program, ingenue of many great things to come, former women's volleyball player at the collegiate level, now a coach around about town in various capacities. Annabeth Fairley, welcome. How are you doing today?
I'm doing so good. I'm happy to be here. I'm basically just here to add some more academic commentary, more just trying to continue my learning on what I can in the communication world. So I'm happy to be here. Thank you.
Absolutely. We were excited to boast that Annabeth has joined the ranks of the lifelong learners community. She is interested in continuous improvement, and that's one of many reasons we see great things in your future, right? Of course, we'd be remiss not to mention recipient of the Media Production Award at in the Comm program at MACU. So all around a student of the form, and so great to kind of have you in tow. You're naturally curious about all things communication. It's intersections as well with media and other areas of interest. And so remind us, we're here to discuss a set of readings, really. We're trying to focus on a series of conversations that will coincide with a class that runs. Typically it runs online for us in an accelerated cycle, and so we're coming together, forming these conversations, producing these talks to supplement that learning process. It's a learning curve because what does it mean to take an accelerated class? Sometimes you're giving up some things in order to gain something else, right? You're giving up, you're looking to gain credit faster. But what you give up maybe is more time truly pouring into materials. And I say you, I mean like you, the student. And so we're looking for ways to help students solve problems, to address issues we're tackling in class. And so we're addressing readings that students are encountering. You're going to read for us, and I'll showcase here the text that we're drawing from for today's conversation.
Oh, I thought you were going to.
Oh, okay.
No, I can. Sorry. We're doing the Communication Theory and Millennial Popular Culture book. And we're doing chapter 10, Seen But Not Heard, Exploring Muted Group Theory and Pixar's The Incredibles, Wall-E and Brave. And really quickly, I just want to talk about how I was a student here and I did take these accelerated courses, and
not all of them, but
no,
you sprinkled it into your schedule.
I took quite a few of them actually, but I just wanted to say, just try to really indulge yourself into these resources while you're here in the class. Take notes, they might come in handy, especially if you are looking to just better your education for the long run. Just try and really read your stuff and take your notes and just apply it to the assignments the best you can. And that's the best advice I can give you. But anyways, this chapter was written by Bruce W. Finkley and Sally Bennett Hardig. What we're really looking at is muted group theory. So what does that mean? Okay. It is when sorry, I have my notes here. It is when a dominant group will place limitations on a subordinate group. And we're going to look how popular Pixar films use this in their movies. And no matter what, we're always going to have a muted group theory somewhere in society, whether it's race, gender, or even class of some sorts. And I just really want to dig into that today. So
it might be worthy. Now, it's so funny how things come full circle. 15 years ago, 20 years ago, it would be so important to teach against students using collaborative, open-sourced, easily editable resources like Wikipedia. Right? In fact, there's a famous bit on The Office where Michael, the foil of all things, is reading something off of Wikipedia as if he's brilliant, right?
Yeah.
And all these years later, it really is, I think we've passed the crossroads where it's always a poor source to be a main source.
Yeah.
But it is, if you understand it in context, valuable in terms of being a starting ramp toward a greater and hopefully wider and deeper body of knowledge. Just sharing the first line on muted group theory from that, or MGT as it's shorthanded. It's a communication theory developed by cultural anthropologists Edwin Ardner and that feminist scholar Shirley Ardner in 1975. So the last time we talked, we mentioned symbolic convergence theory from a QJS Quarterly Journal of Speech in 1972, and here's a piece from 1975. This is really where the communication discipline isn't as old as English. It's not as old as philosophy. Communication as its own discipline isn't 1,000 years old, right? Like some of these things. In fact, it is much newer. It carves out its own space in the 20th century. It really is relatively young, but fortunately still growing, still widening, and that's significant. But as I mentioned in our last conversation, it draws from other disciplines, and I see that, and many of us see it as a virtue, not a deficit, in terms of that shared history. And so you can see where the sociology, which is to be accurate and honest, is kind of more of a downward pointing field, a less prominent field today than it was 50 years ago. It's kind of switched places, whereas communication's still rising somewhat. But you will find sociology, social theories, a part of some of the formative ideas in communication. But it's also, this is a great point to say, just like the last piece, it's valuable to publish in communication journals because it adds distinctness to the field. It helps cultivate our voice in our discipline. And then also by that same token to think about the way we've crafted our major at MacU, media journals, and the like, right? Journals get a bad rap with undergrad students. Let me put it that way. Can I relate to the student for a second and say, students typically, you might find a really meaty, jargon-heavy journal article, and you're just confused. You go through cycles of frustration. You want to put it down. Yeah, you want to put it down. You hate it. You don't want to finish it. Some of it appears to be written in another language altogether because some of it is. And what we're trying to do through these selections is find a new middle ground, and also help shine a light on the value of these ideas in a way that we hope is more reader friendly to the audience. And so that's why we showcase what this book is, where these chapters came from. I've been meaning to talk about, not to disrupt the flow of the conversation, about how this book was crafted intentionally with smaller chapter lengths so that ideas could be worked through in a quicker fashion to be more friendly to that undergraduate level reader. Also, coincidental or not, we're at a time where reading levels and attention spans they've diminished somewhat, and not every student body is carved out exactly the same, and so these kinds of readings can help fill some gaps, and also complement something that you mentioned before, which is when you take an accelerated course and you have less time to be able to devote to absorbing materials and ideas and readings and things, then that's when a shorter reading can really come into play. Like it's kind of like, I don't know how many times, Annabeth, have you traveled internationally on an airplane? Do you have much?
I actually have never traveled. I mean, I've traveled across the country. I've traveled to Mexico. That's pretty much it. That's the farthest I've been. So.
That's fair. You have plenty of life in front of you still. The only reason I use that specific of an example is they seem to no longer provide meals on airplanes anymore. They just want you to invest in like a la carte, additional pay, add like snacks and beverages. But when you travel overseas, they do tend to still give you these full meals, right? A breakfast.
They do it when you go to
lunch,
Hawaii, I think, still.
And but if you've ever had an airline meal, I'll try to make this point make sense. If you've ever had an airline meal, it's compact, it's smaller, right? For a couple of key reasons. There's limited space on an airplane, right? Now that would be the efficiency thing, but then there's also the human element to all this, in that you don't want someone to be sitting in a smaller seat, gorging on a multi-course meal,
Yeah,
right? You need something compact because people are digesting up at 10,000 feet or whatever. You need certain rules and restrictions to be in play. That's a little bit like what we're attempting to do with these reads, is that it's a more condensed version of some bigger ideas, and we're encouraging students, if they're interested, you find a theory you're interested in, we want you to go hunt after it, go find some more resources on it, like do some background digging. That's that research journey, and unpack some things. Well, if you're willing, and unpack some of the ideas playing in this essay for us.
Well, I also just want to talk about this. I do not like reading those big long articles either. This is so easy to read, and it's enjoyable because you're still learning about something but applying it to something that we know about in our society and our culture, and connecting it back to these movies or TV shows is an easy way for us to better understand what they're talking about, what the author is talking about. So let's go ahead and jump in. You already mentioned that this theory was first introduced by anthropologists Edwin and Shirley Ardner, and they observed that many ethnographers, I believe that's how you say it, were creating black holes in research by ignoring female speech when coding or describing cultures, and they argued that this lack of voice, or mutedness, was a reflection of the powerless and lack of status of certain groups in society. So let's take that and apply it to these movies. By the way, this theory is still being developed to this day. There were further scholars that have built on to this theory piece by piece. You know what I mean?
That's a sign of a great theory, by the way.
Yes.
Is that a scholar, not only in one article or study, can't cover everything possible. Sometimes they can't even cover it in their career lifespan, and thus you think of it like a healthy tree that produces fruit. That a tree will last, decades, and 100 years, and there is so much more value to be harvested from the tree. Well, same with a good idea or a great theory.
Absolutely.
And also, it's important to remember there is something to be said in social science research for repeatability, right? And the duplication of a hypothesis, and how that helps confirm a theory and maybe move it from theory to fact. What moves an idea from theory to fact is whether or not it's replicable, the study. And that's why you'll see studies that are very similar kind of go on and on and on, because let's think about something that maybe more in the sciences, like an immunization, right?
Yeah.
Versus the placebo study and all the control elements and all of that. It's because you need replicability to demonstrate that your claims about the thing aren't kind of just pulled out of thin air, or wily, or false, or inconclusive. That you need to demonstrate that, and it's okay for something to also maintain status simply as a theory too. But there's a big debate about how theories that can't move toward fact or invalid or whatever. But that's not necessarily what we're talking about here, because we're kind of riding that line. We're also in the humanities with these ideas, right? We're kind of talking about social theory. When I mentioned sociology before, the social theory, like the ways that people do things and move through things. You mentioned ethnographers before. Well, what is ethnography? Ethnography is if we think about research on a spectrum, ethnography is over here on the qualitative side of research and social theory. Quantitative would be that replicability, the science of it, right? The nth duplication of said report that can continuously demonstrate outcomes of certain. Ethnography is over here in the qualitative area, where we're more interested in the rich details, the unique values of an idea or an observation, and that's where subjectivity has a little more space to play. So this essay is subjective in that they're not trying to say this is exactly what Pixar intends, but rather here are a trio of texts, and here's how it aligns with these theories, and it's up to the reader to
Make
assess
conclusions.
the value of those claims.
I do want to say I think they provided pretty strong evidence about the muted group theory, because it talks here about, the authors talk about how Pixar films found that male characters overwhelmingly outnumber females by a ratio of 3-1. Therefore, not only are there simply fewer female voices to hear, we argue that several of these female characters are muted through Pixar's patriarchal storytelling technique. So we kind of talked about this a couple weeks back in our first...
No, that's right. We had a conversation about Disney's Frozen.
Yes.
And hegemony.
Yes, we kind of see connecting themes a little bit here.
Nice connective tissue here.
And also, to this date, the only Pixar film to have a woman director is Brave. And we're going to talk about that a little bit here. But she actually left before the film was finished. So a male director had to finish it. I want to talk about Brave first because... So we see Princess Merida. She is supposed to marry a prince from one of these other Scottish clans, I guess you could say.
Yeah, that's right.
And they have all these competitions. These men are making fools of themselves, and she goes and shows them up, And the whole film is kind of centered around her defying her father. We kind of see that in other Disney princess films a lot. But she's
challenging the patriarchy.
She is challenging the patriarchy, but her voice was constantly silenced throughout the film. I don't know if you remember. Have you seen this movie?
I have.
Okay, do you remember
it's been a while,
her?
But I've seen it.
Yeah, her mother and her siblings were turned into bears. Do you remember that? And her father just would not believe her. Her father would not take her side on anything, and her voice was silenced, over and over again.
Yeah.
And she finally got through to him, and she overcame that muted group theory. So that's kind of what I got for Brave, but she does challenges that stereotype by taking care of herself, and she challenges that theory. So yeah, but it took the whole movie.
Right. Well, you mentioned that the muted group theory has this evolution, and I think another name worthy of mentioning, communication scholar. Oh, I'm going to get this one ever so slightly wrong, probably, but Cheris Cromery. She had a study later, 1981, where it was modified and kind of placed into the context of gender. And so I watched a number of scholarly talks and videos, processing, considering this while gathering some readings on it too, and thinking more about kind of dusting the cobwebs off in my mind on this. And it has exploded in its usage and value to the women and gender studies community, which started within one discipline, but it's kind of emerged and coexists, no pun intended, in different disciplines now. So if we went on the National Communication Association website, there are different divisions of communication that you could submit scholarly papers to, or panel ideas or things for the national conference. And one of the division is women and gender studies. And so you see these, that's like a strand, not unlike organizational communication or media studies, right? You would see these different political communication, rhetoric, rhetorical theory. You would see these different focus areas. And so women and gender studies sometimes exist within communication, but if we look down the street at OU, it's its own school. You can find its placement could vary based on just the layout of a university structure, or maybe universities don't even have an emphasis area on it, right? Depending on the make and model. And so it's an area of specialization. And I think it has this, if Cheris was aiming it into the context of gender in the early 80s, which by the way, that we were in that post-feminist movement throughout the 1980s, or this kind of, we were entering this third wave period as well, in terms of what the role women were in society, in public versus private, and so on, the role and voice that they had. You now have 21st century usage of this that tends to broaden even more, maybe we also say narrow, toward other groups that would quote unquote be muted, right? Minority groups, or maybe even members of, say, like LGBTQ society and so on. And so that's where you can see like the evolution of a theory. It starts to take on different meaning for different groups, right? That it can they can utilize that to help facilitate language that is not just about talking about a thing, but talking about it to raise attention and then potentially mark a type of, change or case or progress as a result. So we have Brave, as you mentioned, and we also have a couple of other examples.
Okay. Can we talk about Wall-E next?
Yes.
Okay. I love this movie, guys. Okay, so we know it's a story about a little robot who's left by himself pretty much on Earth, okay? And he finds this plant, and, he's rummaging around. He's trying to... It's basically showing what the world would look like, kind of, I guess, in the future due to consumerism, kind of. So he's left there by himself. He's just a little robot.
Dystopian future. Earth has been abandoned because of we weren't good stewards of our stuff.
Yes. So he's there by himself, he's a little collector, a forager, if you will. And we have Eve that comes down to Earth. She was sent by her captain, a male, I will say, in a ship, okay? And she was sent down to find some type of life from planet Earth. And we see Wall-E and Eve kind of have different personalities than you would typically think, because usually it's the woman that wants to fall in love with the man, find true love, is very feminine, and I feel like they kind of gave those qualities to Wall-E instead.
Sure.
And Eve is just a hard-headed, doesn't want anything to do with that. She's on a mission, and she's going to complete that mission for her captain, return to the ship, whatnot, okay? So this is where it kind of, we get into the muted group part of it. The captain is in control of this ship that Eve and Wall-E are returning to. And he is in control of what these people eat, what they think, what they drink, what activities they do, whatnot. And all he wants is Eve to complete her mission. And he doesn't even know that Wall-E's there, But Eve is muted once she finds out that what they're doing is wrong. You know what I mean? The whole situation is wrong. But I don't know. What do you think about the muteness of this?
Well, it's interesting. I love your observations about the
characters.
About the kind of cross coding between Wall-E and Eve. He is ingrained. If we want to talk about media effects and mass communication influence, he grows an awareness of the formerly occupied humanity on Earth by watching vintage musicals. He's got this actual real world musical that's projected that he'll watch and watch and watch over and over again, kind of like we do with our favorite movies or TV shows or things. Yeah, he's got some creature comforts that he's beginning to store away. So he's like a service droid that's supposed to be organizing and cleaning, and he's kind of got his bachelor pad where he's maybe hoarding, collecting things. He's curating identity.
Yes.
And then, but that adoration for the musical and that sense of romanticism is kind of cultivating in him maybe what could be, interpreted, what could be perceived as this more traditionally coded feminine outlook, right? And Eve is... I would call her a surveillance droid, right? She's occupying this space. She even looks like... I drew a parallel. We used this film in a future shop class that students could choose between one of our weeks.
I heard about that.
There's the alternate movie that week, Oblivion, features a surveillance droids that are all white, that kind of look like, floating Apple products or whatever. And they too were doing the same business as Eve. And so there's an interesting parallel between these. But that is very much there's a militaristic approach to that kind of, this is your duty, this is your mission, you must satisfy it in that way.
But in that way, do you think that the captain is like muting like her voice and what she actually thinks? Like she's just a robot that does her job, returns to her station at the end of the night, and that's it. She has like no life, but we see that these robots actually do like have a personality.
Well,
so
I think something that one could explore in the context of this movie is that maybe the coded language here is that the robots are muted in terms of having agency. That's a term that's important in communication and rhetoric, that they don't have agency to express themselves. Star Wars has the same complication with the droids are always tagging along. They're the sidekicks, but they can't go into the cantina in the original Star Wars. Like there's something happening where droids are viewed in a class conscious way, where they're subverted within the status quo. And I see this tension here where these droids, these robots, are meant to function in service of humankind's greater aspirations, and their wants and needs are getting muted. Does that make sense? Over their programming.
Do you think that, wasn't there like a rebellion, like a robot rebellion, kind of like in the end of the movie, like in WALL-E? Kind of a little bit, like, don't they start like kind of like...
Yeah, they go again, they're breaking protocol, right?
Yes.
They're...
So I think that's a good example of what happens when voices are muted, is that people start to rebel against this stereotype or this situation because they want their voices to be heard too. So and it's all the pieces are kind of clicking together now for me, that even just like a Pixar film intended for children has these deeper meaning behind it. So
that desire to kind of claw beneath the surface a little more, to kind of keep digging. Well, the oldest, I believe, of these three films included is The Incredibles. But that might be the most prolific of the three also, right? Would you say? It was a huge hit that so long
Great
did it
movie.
kind of, it was almost one of those in the DVD age, right? When DVDs were selling really hot, it was probably moving a lot. And one of the, first Pixar movies to get kind of universal acclaim. I mean, Toy Story did, to be honest, and its follow-up, but there was something going on where Incredibles was finding a peak formula before superhero movies were even finding like that 4-quadrant effort in terms of like just checking the boxes the right way, like hitting it kind of clearly, resonating, and yet they're put into this conversation here. So that's to say their voices exist that would say put a movie like The Incredibles in check. And were you able to, to kind of see why and where and how the critique is coming into play here?
So, again, it really focuses on a woman. It focuses on Helen, which is also known as...
Let's describe that.
Elastigirl.
Elastigirl, yes.
So, she's the mother of the Incredibles.
So, she's a mom, right? A mother figure, which that has its own framework, in the feminist theory that would...
She is a mom, but a hero. And so she has to take on both of those roles. But I think that her husband is a little bit silencing.
Which, in the history of feminist theory, that's what we would call a double bind.
Okay.
That females face the double pressure without the double release of both. Society is expecting that they work, but then also expecting that they be the mother, or if and to be a mother in a nuclear context would be to be somewhat submissive or at least compliant wife, to have X number of duties in the household, right? You think about the things like the household chores, or maybe some of the
taking care of their baby.
I mean, historically, there is a framing device around what the roles of the home look like in a period of time in history, and this is recent history where the division of labor between men and women was different, and it was both defined differently, but in terms of belief decisions, in terms of ideology, viewed differently, right? Men might be viewed as more external figures. Leave the home, whether it's leave the home to farm the land, or leave the home to work in the factory, or leave the home to drive into the city, and so on. And then the internal, like domestic roles, were coded as female, and so people in 2025, we've become too divisive with these terms and these histories and these, the social roots of so much of what we're talking about today, to their detriment. Feminist theory is a really fascinating and informative look at dramatic change that was unfolding in the ways in which women began to more recognize in a modernistic fashion, and then speak out toward and gather momentum toward increased independence, change of roles, and situational agency, and so on. Like X Factor upon X Factor, all of that is really fascinating and enriching tale of social progress that unfortunately gets stewed into the quote-unquote culture wars that we encounter. And we often encounter culture wars through things like cable news and talk radio,
social media,
we get recoded to then have to, this is, not to pull in like Joseph Campbell level of anthropology and social theory into this, but we myth make, and when you're myth making, you create archetypes and you lean on archetypes. And there's no more dominant archetypes in Western history than to code things as, heroes and villains. And when an idea doesn't 100% align with our preconceived notions of how they ought to be, we tend to code them as, this is what a different cultural critic, Edward Said, referred to as the other, like capital O, other. We tend to otherize things, right? And so in the otherizing, right, in this method of dualistic opposition as a way to read reality, we have a tendency so often to want to say it's either this or it's this, right? And we assume it has to be either this way or that way. And feminist theory is, I'm going to forget some of the names, but they're more than a handful. Feminist theory is often described as more of a pluralistic way of approaching constructs of symbolic language and how we communicate. And instead of either this or this, they're arguing that there's space for both and, right? That there are alternatives to, door number one versus door number two. I sometimes use a out of left field example of like the myth of Coke versus Pepsi, right? This was like the cola wars of the 1980s and 90s. Are you Coke or are you Pepsi? And this is a ludicrous premise. I think we talked about it maybe once in the advertising class. That's a false binary, because they're both colas. First of all, like there are infinite number of alternatives to both choices, and neither, once we realize, are healthy for us. The argument falls apart, because what was it to begin with? It was an advertising campaign to help boost sales. It's a false premise. So it's too often, this is my long way around making a claim that I don't think people get exposure to, and very often.
I agree.
Because we tend to get formed into enclaves that really hold a position that it's not quite as threatening as I think it's made out to be. I think there's a lot of myth making into some of the claims about feminist theory that many of the ways in which we enjoy freedoms today are a result of a lot of work and effort and social progress that took place over the course of that. And it gets refined into really just a stereotypical stew due to, a couple of, often it's the loud outlier that can maybe turn someone off of an idea, and then they begin to form and think of that one idea as representative of the whole thing.
Yeah.
And I think that's what has happened in the wide culture, that what the most extreme iterations of feminist movements became the model of what the whole thing was, and it's not an accurate reflection, and we lose out as a result. But The Incredibles gives us that tension of Elastigirl has, well, even like that term, right? It's not Elasti-Woman.
Just the name.
Elastigirl.
It sounds
right?
like
It's kind of,
it sounds like a child's name, because the other one we see is Incrediboy. So why wouldn't she be woman? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I'm thinking this was a decently early, I think this came out at a good time for what was like going on in the world at the moment, because I think it just like she broke through like those stereotypes and just kept breaking them in the movie and putting them down. And she even quotes, she says, "Settle down, like, are you kidding? I'm at the top of my game. I'm right up there with the big dogs." Like, she's challenging and she's talking kind of like a man. Like, she just wants to be treated the same way as these male superheroes are getting treated. You know what I mean?
She's breaking that glass ceiling for the female athletes,
She is. And, you know, she was even silenced whenever her husband traveled to do super secret superhero work with, because that woman called him and was like, you know, and she ended up being the villain. But she had nothing to complain about when he came back, because they were fitting the happy family kind of montage. So anyways, basically she was the muted group in this movie, but she did overcome those stereotypes that I think a lot of people were looking at in this movie. She played both parts. She was the mom and she was the hero, and she was able to do both. What helps
articulate maybe the political commentary going on with The Incredibles is they frame it with a 1960s kind of milieu in terms of the music choice. Very much sounds like throwback James Bond. You know, this kind of like the swinging 60s vibe to it. Even the superhero narrative has it's kind of retro layer to modern layer. That is to suggest in the former years the rules were very distinct and written this way, but now we've moved into the modern society, and it's time to alter that history. And so the movie is very aware of the past versus the present and what's taking place to create change, and that how Mr. Incredible has this under the radar job, and superheroes have gone underground. That's even playing off of like Cold War politics and how we switched from overt, nuclear World War engagement to more of like clandestine engagement below the radar.
For sure.
And so the movie has all these intellectual labors that's again, for a quote unquote children or family film, that none of that is registering with children, but for the adults, that is absolutely in the realm of subtext. And the subtext is the additional text that's going on if you're close reading the artifact, if you're understanding that it's sending numerous messages to you, not just to put the kids to bed for a nap or to satisfy people in the theater for 90 minutes, but that it's actually doing some cultural business in its storytelling.
Well, yeah, and like the thing is obviously when we watch these as a kid, we don't realize this, and it's watching it back that you realize, wow, there's a deeper message behind all of these movies, and it is the subtext. And even watching a movie for the first time as an adult like this, I probably wouldn't have even read between the lines. But now that we're looking at it from this perspective, you get to see so many different things beneath the surface, and it's so cool. It really is. It's cool if you really just apply yourself to understanding it a little bit better. It's cool.
For students in this class, or maybe just new students studying media, you're stumbling onto this conversation or video or whichever format we're using to put the message out, consider that for our students specifically, they have a media analysis project that they're building, and for some that's a new experience. For others, they're learning how to do it. And different classes we offer, they're going to hit that from different angles, different techniques that you're picking up on, and this is an analytic exercise, right? The goal is to close read, as Barry Brummett would say, or analyze the text deeper. And one of the values of this particular essay is I like that the co-authors, Finklia and Hardig, they put multiple artifacts in conversation with one another. I love a good trick like this, like either putting 2 artifacts in conversation or 3. I think there is such a thing as maybe getting too messy with too many focus points.
I think this was a good, simple mix. We got 3. 3 is a good number. 3 is a good number to just dive in, break them down a little bit piece by piece, and I like that they alternated between the pages, section by section. You know what I mean? Like they had one paragraph here, next one was Wally, next one was Brave. It meshed really well together, and it was easily digestible, I think, for especially me, but I hope for some of the other students in the class as well.
You highlight something really important, that the subsections within essays. It's important to pay attention to how authors structure those. These are examples that we can be picking up on and then learning about. How do I become a more analytic, not just reader, writer? And we're hoping people will examine this media and then be able to make some just strategic and analytic decisions for themselves too. But that subsections, even the wording of the subheaders themselves, it's a great space to communicate ideas, to build something, to kind of, that all of these work together as the pieces to build little arguments.
I agree.
And these arguments are about media. They're about the work media does. And so let's remember a paraphrased definition of rhetoric is it's the examination of all the means of persuasion, drawing upon Aristotle there and kind of updating it. But to be able to look at a piece of media, and the media could be a movie, it could be an animated movie, it could be a book, it could be a comic book, it could be a television program, it could be any number, an advertisement, and so on, and to say, how is this being persuasive? Or what ideas, but aka theories or methods from a given discipline, can I bring in to say we can better understand the theory or concept through using this popular artifact, or by using this popular theory or jargon, how can we better understand the work being done by the pop culture text itself? So that's a way to kind of bring things full circle. Really appreciated your insights, Beth. Great job.
It was very interesting. I really liked the idea of this theory because it does point out how not everyone's going to have an equal say in something. There's always going to be a hushed voice, and that's honestly just our society, but I think that it is important if you have something that you want to say to speak your truth. So,
and important to note, just like these articles these book chapters can't possibly express everything there's to say about either the text or the theory, these conversations we're having, we're scratching the surface. And we encourage folks to look deeper, to dig deeper, to continue the independent research process. One journal article or book chapter or essay is not going to fully immerse you in the concept. And that's going back to something we said at the beginning of the program relating to you, the lifelong journey of lifelong learning is a journey, and it's a recognition that there's always these layers to keep advancing in our knowledge base, and that's that sample size that helps reinforce and solidify our confidence in any given claim or message strategy. And so learning how to think deeper, more critically about media is important in and of itself. And hopefully these conversations are helping demonstrate another extra layer of that. Well, thank you so much for joining.
Of course. course. Thanks for having me. It was super fun, and I'm glad we got to talk about the book today. So.
Absolutely. And so we're looking forward to that. We're looking forward to continuing these conversations for our Mass Communication Perspectives season here on Special Topics in Media.
Bye.